Thank you for joining Direct Women's webinar on top tips for building a board-ready career. My name is Kelsey Velma, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Director of Programs and Operations here at Direct Women, and I'm excited to be hosting this session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen right now and hear my voice. The phone lines, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. At the top right of your screen is the GoToWebinar panel. Just open the console, find the questions section, type your question, and hit submit. Feel free to submit questions at any time. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of content followed by a few minutes for Q&A. Our speakers' biographies are available for download in the handout section of the GoToWebinar console. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no more than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I would like to turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Michelle Banks. Michelle?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you to all of our audience members for joining us. We had a record sign up for today's program. I am glad that you're as excited as I am to talk about top tips for building a board-ready career. My name, as Kelsey said, is Michelle Banks. I'm a senior advisor at Barker Gilmore, where I'm an executive leadership coach for Women General Counsel. Before joining Barker Gilmore, I was a board secretary and general counsel of GAP. I serve on the Direct Women Board of Directors, and it is my pleasure to tell you that Direct Women has been in business for 15 years. For 15 years, we've been focused on our mission of helping women prepare and encouraging women to join corporate boards. I am excited that this week, actually, not next week, this week on September 1st, the Board Institute, which is our signature program annually, will open applications. So if you're interested, check that out at directwomen.org. Our website has a lot of great information. I encourage you to check it out frequently. I am now excited to introduce our panelists. We are pleased to have Delissa Alexander, April Miller-Boyes, and Alex Mishawek with us today. And it's my pleasure to tell you a little more about them. Delissa is an alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute class of 2011. She's a former chief people officer at tech company Red Hat. She serves on the boards of 2 private technology companies, Sophos and Click, both of which she joined this year. April is an alumna of the Direct Women class of 2018. She serves on the board of directors of Train Technologies, a climate innovator that builds systems controls, and she previously served on the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Cincinnati. She's also, as many of you know, the chief legal officer of Intel. Alex is an alumna of the Direct Women class of 2016. She's a former chief transformation officer and general counsel of Cooper Standard, a public company. She serves on the board of directors of Solid Power, a private rechargeable battery company, and New York Stock Exchange listed Tenneco, an automotive manufacturing company. So welcome to all the panelists. Thank you for making the time to be with us, and let's get started with some questions. As Kelsey said, you should feel free to submit your questions as well. We look forward to answering them later in the program. So let's get started with Delissa. Please share with us how and why you joined a corporate board.
Well, I'll start with the why and then I'll hit the how. So for my many years supporting the Red Hat board, I saw firsthand the tremendous positive influence that a board can have on an organization, particularly in a crisis. So after I retired, I thought about what could I do that would be my highest and best value to a board and an organization. And I decided with my enterprise software experience and corporate governance experience that my highest and best use would be to a mission-driven company that's probably pre-IPO, that has an inspiration and an aspiration of maturing their governance and maybe going public in the future, maybe not. Once I was able to articulate what kind of company I wanted for my first boards, I reached out to my former boss, who was the Red Hat CEO, and we worked together for many, many years, and reminded him of my aspirations. And since I was really clear about what I was wanting, he was able to connect me right away with some partners at Thoma Bravo, which is a private equity firm that focuses on enterprise software companies, and had many conversations that ultimately led me to my 2 boards, both purpose-driven organizations in the enterprise software space. And now that I've checked that box, my next step is to begin thinking about perhaps a public company board.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I love your advice of build a relationship with a CEO and impress them. April, share with us how and why you joined a corporate board.
Sure. So I've been on 2 different corporate boards, and maybe I'll speak to both of them quickly, and then we're happy to obviously take questions later if the audience wants more. But the first board I was on was the Federal Home Loan Bank of Cincinnati. And so it is a government, what we call a government-sponsored entity or a quasi-government entity. So they have public filings, but they don't have public shareholders. And then the board that I'm on now, and I served on that board for 3 years, the board that I'm on now is Train Technologies. It's a public company, New York Stock Exchange traded, and it's a pure play, what we call pure play climate innovation company. The first board that I joined was actually very serendipitous, and I joined it right before I did the Direct Women program. And so I had already been invited to, had already applied and joined the Direct Women class that had not started yet. And so that board came about really through networks that I had in the business community. So another woman who was a business leader was on a number of public company boards. She happened to be on that board, and they were doing a board search, and she recommended me to the search firm. And really, she recommended me, I think, primarily because of my experience in corporate governance. She also was a corporate governance expert and a corporate lawyer, and I really knew her from the community. And so that's a great way to think about as you're building your network, making sure you're talking to other people that are on boards, and what do they know about your background and your expertise. And then the other board that I'm on, Train Technologies, I actually was reached out to by an executive search firm. And they were really interested in me as a candidate, I think, for 2 things. Number 1, my M&A experience, and number 2, my international experience, and I would say manufacturing industry experience. So I think those are the things that made me an attractive candidate for Train Technologies.
That's helpful. So some of the buzzwords, corporate governance, M&A, international experience, all very helpful when you're selling yourself to a board, whether it's through your direct network or through search. And it's interesting to know that you got your 2 boards very differently. Alex, what about you? How and why are you on boards?
So my story is not that different. Actually, networking and fit was very important for both of my boards. I'd like to talk a little bit about the solid power, because that was highlighted how relationships matter and industry experience matters. So solid power is actually just recently went public last year. It was part of that SPAC craze in the EV space. And I had been following that very closely because I do have a passion about automotive, a passion about electric vehicles and the whole transformation that's taking place. I happened to read an article about Solid Power's upcoming public offering. And I noticed that that referenced an investment banking firm that helped them with their Series B financing, which is the financing that usually precedes, one of them that precedes the offering itself. Turns out I reached out to my contact. I had developed this relationship actually only a couple of years ago, but I developed it and worked on it. He didn't know anything about it, reached out to his team in Silicon Valley. We got on Zoom. They were gracious enough to recommend me to the board chair. And so that's the relationship part. Always make sure that you're very cognizant of people who are in and around the board space, and make sure that you develop good relationships and you maintain them and cultivate them. On the fit part, luckily Solid Power was looking for someone with automotive experience. And so because of the breadth of my experience, it was a great fit. So networking, fit, it's a great combo.
Thank you. Okay, new topic. Looking back at your own career, how did you first get experience in a corporate boardroom? Because we have people across generations participating in this webinar. What are some of your thoughts and ideas on how they can get in the boardroom? Or give us an example or a story of how you first got yourself into a corporate boardroom, because that's not necessarily easy to do. How about we go in reverse order, and Alex, I'll have you go first.
All right. Well, I spent the bulk of my career as an M&A and corporate securities lawyer at an AmLaw 200 firm, Dykema, and we represented a number of small to mid-cap public companies. And now, without discussing my age in any way, shape, or form, it was an era, I grew up in an era of a lot of activity. It was takeover activity, it was the dot-com boom, it was IPOs everywhere. So I was very fortunate that the companies that we represented were always having major transactions the board had to deal with. So as a young associate, I was able to get into that boardroom first, sort of that silent observer, the one who did all the work, prepared the deck, made sure everything, and sitting there, scared to death that something's wrong, but doesn't say anything. And then up to, of course, as a partner, advising those boards, with respect to their fiduciary duties. So it was fortunate, the timing and the type of clientele that we had. But the one thing that I would say is it wasn't automatic. There were several occasions where I wasn't planned. It wasn't a plan that I attend the board meeting. I, in fact, I realized it was happening. I had to, get up my nerve and ask to attend. Some would say beg. I've done that in the past. And, you really have to be proactive. So if there's any bit of advice here is keep your eyes and ears open for those opportunities and ask for them, because partners usually, if they can, they will do it, depending on the circumstances. It may not always be possible, but they may forget. So be out there, be in front of them and ask to get into that boardroom.
I always like just ask advice. Delissa, I'm going to have you go next because April mentioned that she has thought about this in terms of her team. So April, I'm going to have you go last and talk less about yourself and more about your team. But Delissa, how did you first break into the corporate boardroom?
Well, when I went in-house with Red Hat, I was the second lawyer, and Red Hat had just gone public. It was the dot-com boom. And our general counsel, there's only two of us, so our general counsel asked me to act as the assistant secretary and record the minutes because he found it tiresome, but he also wanted to give me a chance to be exposed to the board, which was just wonderful. And that was a real time of transition. It was a time when the SEC was starting to really mandate new independence rules, and so I had this front row seat and seeing the transition from having a kind of kitchen cabinet board to attracting and recruiting a new highly qualified, expert, high integrity set of board members. So two individuals who were really prominent. One was Dr. Stephen Albrecht, who was a professor of accounting and forensics and fraud. And then the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General H.U. Shelton. So they joined our board and they really brought this new professionalism with them. And within months of them joining, we discovered that we needed to restate our earnings. And so this was really high drama for our little company. And I got to support those two new board members as they helped us to successfully navigate this crisis. And then we went on and created this huge amount of shareholder value, ultimately selling to IBM 19 years later. And so for 19 years, I never missed a board meeting. First I was the assistant secretary, and then I moved over to be on the management team leading the people organization, but I just loved it. Like that was a passion for me, and the opportunity. Once I got in, I made sure that I was doing all that grunt work to make sure I had an opportunity to ask for that seat at the table, and it worked out great.
That's a great story because I know I didn't think it sounded very sexy at all to take the minutes of a board meeting. But what people have to realize is sometimes in trade-off for taking the minutes, you get relationships with really important, powerful people. Okay, April, how do you get your team into the boardroom?
So, first of all, let me just say I completely agree with the comments that have already been made, and Michelle, what you just said. So interestingly enough, when I when I was interviewing for the train board, I asked a former director, somebody who had been on the board where I had been a GC before, to recommend me to be one of my references. And he said, absolutely. He said, you'll be a great board member because you already have almost been a director, because you're in the boardroom all the time. And so I think having that experience being in the boardroom is really critical, just to kind of see what's going on and to demystify it. So I am a really big believer. Number one, I think the board is really responsible for ensuring that the company has the right talent. And one of the ways that the board can do that is by, meeting the talent, not just the senior leadership team, but also deeper in the organization. And so one of the things that I really liked when I was at Eaton is that it was really important for the leadership team and very important for the board to meet people who were really responsible for preparing the materials. And so the board would say, hey, we really want to see not just April or not just the people on the leadership team, but their team who ultimately is responsible for this subject matter. And so I always try to get my team in front of the board, and I definitely, will do that at Intel as well. I think, the board really wants to see the team of people that are responsible for, what's going on in the organization. And it's a great opportunity for people to meet the board by presenting to them and being in the board meeting to present on the things that they know a lot about. Number one, that, takes some of the stress out of it, right? They're presenting about something that they're very well versed in, and it really gives the board a chance to see people on their feet and to evaluate the talent as it's developing and to determine whether they think we have a good people strategy.
Great. Okay, now I have some individual questions, starting with you, Delissa. How did you first learn corporate governance? You told us you got invited to be the assistant secretary. So how did you develop some expertise in the area of corporate governance?
Well, this started way back in law school because I knew I wanted to be a corporate lawyer with a JD MBA. And so I really found my stride in securities law and loved studying the cases decided by the Delaware Court of Chancery, the breach of fiduciary duty cases, all so fascinating to me to understand the people dynamics in the boardroom along with the law. And so when I was getting ready to graduate and it was time to apply for clerkships, there was only one clerkship I wanted, and that was with the Delaware Court of Chancery. And I got the clerkship and clerked for Chancellor Chandler, which was amazing. So I had this incredible year of feasting on corporate cases to really help me hone in those skills. But then, went on further and really jumped into it deeply at Red Hat. So the opportunities I had to help us kind of mature our practices, because there's so much happening with the SEC new rules during the time that I was supporting the board. That was an opportunity to really stay on top of it by continuing to study, go on NACD, read all the articles, the blue ribbon commissions, all of that material. It's so helpful.
In case anyone doesn't know, NACD is the National Association of Corporate Directors, and they do have a wealth of in-person and online programming to study corporate governance from a academic expert, but as well as a practical director-driven situation. Alex, how did you develop your business and financial acumen in particular? And do you have anything you would recommend to others the way Delissa did?
So it's always wonderful to hear everybody's path, and it's very exciting. So as an M&A and securities lawyer, obviously understanding financial statements is critical. Unfortunately, I did not have any accounting, any finance in my background, so I had to play a lot of catch up, and that involved studying as much as I could. There's probably books in my library right now, on basics on financial statements. Certainly there are webinars for lawyers on financial statements, and really understanding how the company functions. But more importantly, I think the area of law that I would practice in required a lot of reading of the 10Qs and 10Ks. And while they are not exciting stuff, they really do help you start understanding how the biggest picture and then how the finances work within the company. the things that I would recommend, because that's just the finance part. Then there's the business part, which is actually, you know, you have to have one with the other, but the business is so fascinating. I think all of us will say that we loved, as when you were in the firm, personally, I loved dealing with every new business I had to deal with because it was a brand new industry, it was a brand new knowledge that I could acquire. And having the opportunity to talk to the business people and get to know more about, you know, what they're thinking about, what keeps them up at night, that's really part and parcel of your journey to be a business lawyer and to then ultimately be able to serve on the board. And so some of the recommendations actually that I made both for my teams when I was at the law firm, but also for my team at Cooper Standard, is to really spend time, you know, having those conversations and also get to know the competition. You get to know a lot about your own company if you understand the competitive landscape. And that's what constantly is top of mind, right, of the C-suite. Get to know who they are and understand what they're doing. And so if that means getting them on your Yahoo Finance so you know where their stock is going, if they're public, and getting them on your Google alerts, or if you have the time, I always recommended listening to the earnings calls. You learn a lot by those quarterly earnings calls, especially those questions the analyst asks. And so you get to know the business, and then you have an added benefit, because if you actually then share that knowledge with your business people, all of a sudden they're going to go, oh my God, this is not just a lawyer. This is a person who understands and cares. And when you say, you know, how did that acquisition that our competitor just made affects our, strategic, mission? They'll say, this is exactly the type of person I want on my team, someone who looks beyond, just the four letters of the legal documents. So, make sure you understand that landscape. The other advice I would have, especially for those of you who are in outside law firms, don't underestimate the value of getting involved in management. Having served on the executive board, I was on the comp committee, I ran the business department in the auto group. You really understand that business. That's a business, right?
Right.
And so a lot of the revenue, the expenses, all of those considerations, the human capital, how you keep your people happy, that all happens in the law firm. And when you're in management at a law firm, you really get to see that firsthand, probably for the first time. Certainly, if you're in-house, make those relationships and see if you have an opportunity to work on special projects and also be able to add value as a strategic partner to the business. And that will all, really just add to your value as an ultimate board member.
That's a great segue to what I was going to ask April to talk about, which is you're definitely considered to be an expert and a thought leader in your industry. How did you develop your reputation, your brand, your expertise so that you would be known as, sort of a go-to expert in the area of manufacturing?
That's a really good question. And I definitely think it happens over time, and I probably wasn't as intentional about it as I would be, looking back and maybe going back earlier in my career. But anybody who knows me loves that I'm a manufacturing girl. I love manufacturing. And I think to Alex's point, I really dig in and learn the business. And so obviously now I'm in the semiconductor business, but as part of it, it's still manufacturing. And it's one of the reasons that my CEO was really interested in bringing me to Intel is because of my background in manufacturing and Train Technologies. Again, they were interested in me because of my, background in manufacturing, international manufacturing. And I think for me, it's always been a really important part of how I do my job is really digging in to learn the business, learning as much as I can about the business to really anticipate the issues that I think the business is going to face. And there really is just no substitute. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Are you guys?
A little bit.
Okay, there really is no substitute for doing that. And so I think it just takes time, right? And so you're working very closely with business leaders in your own organization. You might be getting involved in trade associations, reading a lot of trade press. To Alex's point, learning as much as you can about the competitive landscape, because again, that just makes you a better business leader to understand kind of where do we fit in the ecosystem? What are our strengths and, versus the strengths of our competitors? what's our strategy versus their strategy. So, listening to those earnings calls. And a lot of our organizations, we have teams of people that are in our strategy group, and they'll send out summary of those, calls if you can't listen yourself. So it really is about, for me, again, talking to my peers and other GCs and talking to the board and, sometimes writing articles about my love of the industry and my interest in the industry. And I think that really is what has driven people to know me as somebody that loves, manufacturing. Like Alex, I spent a lot of time in Detroit and in automotive manufacturing, and that's really where I started and I cut my teeth. But I've worked in a lot of different companies and in different industries, different manufacturing industries.
Thank you. Helpful. Shifting gears a little bit, Delissa, I wanted to ask you about your experience in the Direct Women Board Institute. I was making a plug earlier that our applications will open on September 1st for the 2023 Board Institute. Why should women lawyers consider applying for Direct Women, and what did you feel that you gained from the program?
Well, the program is amazing, and I think I was like in the third class. And so it's amazing to me that we're now at 15 years. So first of all, the value it brought to me was that if someone thought enough of me to nominate me. So that was very eye-opening, someone from outside my firm. And that was actually Catherine Arrowwood, who's currently the chair. And she's been very committed to the organization. And then the whole process, it really makes you think through, is this something that you're serious about? So getting recommendations. So my chair, General Shelton, my CEO, they both supported me with recommendations, and again, reinforced positively that, yes, people see that this is something you could do one day. And then the process of putting together the board resume and the bio and getting lots of feedback, very painful process, never fun. But once I did that, always maintained it and updated it regularly because it was so painful to put together the first time. And then it helped me feel confident after talking to recruiting organizations that came in and presented, comfortable putting my interests out there from time to time and having an occasional conversation. I did not have the time. There was no way I could join a board before I retired. But nonetheless, I had a couple of conversations just to continue to understand the relevance of, and really highlighted the relevance of what I learned at the Institute. And then I would say just overall, the process, the support of the organization and the connections that have been made, it just helped to solidify that this is the path that I wanted to go down. I knew I had the resources and the network to help, and I would highly recommend it.
It's funny, you were in one of the first classes. I was in one of the more recent classes, and I didn't mind putting the bio and the resume together at all. I just was terrified by the exercise to make your elevator pitch and perfect your pitch. So it's funny, different people like different parts of the program, but it is a valuable program and an incredible network to get into. As you mentioned, the cohort is incredible. The speakers are incredible, and the access to the search firms is really unparalleled. So April, on a different topic, you mentioned something that I hadn't really thought that much about when we were preparing, which is that you're seeing that there are opportunities now that there are sort of extra committees, the committees that are not just the 3 required committees for a public company. But as companies think about dividing their boards in different ways, focusing their boards in different ways, you were talking about the different opportunities that different committees can offer and how that can bring in more diverse people and people with different expertise. So talk to the group a little bit about that.
Sure. I would say where I've seen this play itself out most and most recently are really in 2 areas. So number one, every board is, of course, continuing to look at the total makeup of their board, kind of the average tenure, the average age, the backgrounds and experience of the entire group. And so it's not just, people who are 75 who are retired CEOs anymore. That if you look back 20 years ago, that was very much kind of the makeup of most boards. And so I think we've seen this change for a number of reasons, but I think 2 of the places where you can see people who have not been CEOs before be still very, very attractive board candidates is most companies are looking at, who are not in technology space, are looking at how does technology impact their industry, how's it impacting their industry, and what's their technology and their digital journey. So many companies now have a technology subcommittee of the board, or certainly some committee on the board is really focused on technology. And that's just a place where you tend to see younger executives. And so you're seeing, that age diversity, if you will, in boards. And then the other place I would say we see a lot of new committees is around ESG and sustainability. So sometimes it's just sustainability focused, sometimes it's the broader ESG mandate, sometimes that sits within an existing committee or gets divided among the main committees. But some companies are starting to say, hey, this is really important. We want to have a separate ESG committee. And again, I think that's a place where you can just see more diversity, women and people of color who aren't necessarily CEOs, right? We know our number of public company CEOs is very small, that are underrepresented minorities and women. But those other places, we tend to see more diversity. And I have seen that when boards are looking at candidates, these are two places where you see much more diversity in that candidate pool.
That's helpful. Thank you. Alex and Delissa, I want to invite you to chime in if there's anything that you would like to talk about with respect to that topic of what is an expertise that if you were starting over, you might try to get so that you could get on one of these committees, or something interesting about what are happening with committees at your companies.
So from my perspective, I'm actually chairing both of my non-gov committees, both at Tenneco and at Solid Power. And at one of those companies, we are very actively, to April's point, looking at our committee structure to decide, should we perhaps add another committee? Should it be technology? Could it be innovation? Maybe it could house ESG, or should we expand the charters of our current committees and to house some of these new requirements? But I think that it is fascinating to see how companies have broadened sort of the scope. Now, functional expertise is becoming much more doable as a board sort of bio entree. And I've seen actually, in particular, supply chain issues, especially in the automotive space. I've heard and have been approached, do you have any supply chain expertise? Because that's one where, people are seeing that it's probably not going to go away. So that's one. Cybersecurity, I think, is critical to all facets, any business. And so if you happen to be also a veteran and you happen to have cybersecurity expertise, I mean, you can sort of pack together a couple of different sort of board bio attributes that could be very, very attractive. So I totally agree that now is the time. And what I would advise people to do is just think about the future and start focusing on which areas, if you can, will be important to the business world, to our economy, 10 years out, 15 years out, whenever you're going to be in the market, and see if you can find that niche that would be very valuable.
Can I make a comment on that, Michelle?
Of course.
I was just going to say I completely agree with Alex, and I didn't focus on this, but she made the point, and I just want to reiterate it. I think people who are CIOs or chief information officers or in that side of technology at companies are also now really attractive board candidates. And so we're seeing a lot more women who are CIOs, being tapped to join boards for that very reason. The cyber piece is really critically important, but also just the technology journey, including information technology.
And I don't want to take away anything from Delissa, I'm sorry, but human capital is huge now. And so executive with, executive comp experience and just understanding to manage that are also very important.
Yeah, I was going to add that this year, it looks like the top concern of boards, whether it's public or private, is talent. And so when I moved over to lead the people organization at Red Hat, it was a big decision. And at the time, it was very unusual. And, people were not looking at people officers for board roles very frequently. And what has happened now, fast forward, 15 years later, There's lots of interest because talent is such a huge issue for most organizations. And so combine that executive comp SEC understanding with some talent practices. That would be a piece of advice that I think could be very valuable to you.
Yeah, it is interesting. I just think back to my 10 years as a general counsel, and there was a lot of interest on the HR side, the human capital side, because I was at a company with over 100,000 employees. But supply chain was not an exciting, interesting thing to talk about in the boardroom, even though supply chain was really important to our company. And now I imagine it's talked about in the boardroom constantly at every company. So it is, I like your advice of thinking about trends and thinking about what's coming in the future and being focused around innovation or crisis solutions. Very helpful. So I want to remind the audience as we hit the 20-minute left mark or 25 minutes left mark that you can ask questions if you would like to. I can't see if you have questions yet, but Kelsey's going to tell me about that in a few minutes. But I have these three great panelists here. So if you have questions for them, we would love to talk about what you would love to hear about. I do have two more questions for them, but I would love to answer your specific questions too. So I like this question. What would you do differently? I ask this on just about anything I ever get to moderate. What would you do differently? What would you do more of? What would you focus on specifically if you were starting your career today and you knew what you know now as a corporate director, having been in corporate boardrooms at your own companies and now at several other companies for all of you? What would you do differently? What might you focus on? How might you approach things? April, you started to touch on this when you said that you weren't as intentional as you would have been. But I bet there's other things, and I just think this is kind of a fun question. So Delissa, I'll start with you.
I'll definitely go back to the financial statements. I remember when we were preparing SEC documents and filings and sitting in these meetings with your committee members trying to make sure your financial statements are ready to go, and then there's this minutia in the footnotes, and there's all these rules that you need to be able to follow and understand because there's so much important information in the footnotes. And I remember just thinking, oh, just please get me out of this meeting. But the financial acumen and understanding the rules around the financial statements is really, really critical. And I'll just highlight one more time. Listen to earnings calls. Like, get all this information about what your investors care about from those calls. And as a board member, that's who you're going to be representing. So taking that investor perspective and helping whoever you're working with, whether you're inside counsel, outside counsel, to think through what their investors are looking for, having that acumen really makes you kind of a differentiated board member.
And a team member for those that are more in the beginning of their career, mid-career. I was always impressed, and I could always tell the members of my team who actually read our 10Ks, 10Qs, who actually read the financial statement footnotes, who listened to earnings calls, because they just sound more business and financially savvy, and they can take competitive factors and strategic factors into consideration when they're giving legal advice. So even if you're not in a boardroom and you're 10 years from being in a boardroom, your manager, your boss, other people will take notice of the fact that you actually are paying attention to your investors, to your industry, to your SEC documents if you're a public company. Okay, I want to get to everyone. April, what would you do differently?
I think I'll piggyback on something that Delissa just said. So I was an accounting major, went to business school. And so people are like, oh, it's great. You have that accounting background. And of course, I do. You always have it. But it's not like I used it every day. I never was a CPA. So I would, again, focus on, I think I can't emphasize this enough. I think particularly for our audience that is probably a lot of lawyers. I think somebody said it this week in another meeting I was in, like, hey, I became a lawyer because I wasn't good at the numbers part, or I didn't want to focus on that. It's critically important as lawyers that you are really able to understand the financial statements. And so maybe you don't want to read the 10K from cover to cover, but you should certainly be very familiar with what information is where. And I would say, read the MD&A. That's a really important part of your disclosure because it helps you really understand what is driving your revenue, your margin, whether you're growing or not. I mean, it's the company really talking about what happened this quarter. And so that's critically important to understand. And I would also focus again on, I wish earlier in my career, even when I was in private practice, I wish I had listened to kind of every earnings call, if you will, right? And so that takes a lot of time, but the value of that is critically important. And if you can't listen to all of them, number one, they're taped, so you can listen to them later. I would say definitely, read the earnings deck, like what is the company saying about itself in the deck, but also really listen to the Q&A, even if you don't listen to what the CEO and what the CFO are saying, which are of course really important, but they're really telling you what they want to focus on, right? The investors are asking the questions about what they think is going well or not well with the business and really comparing you to your peers. And so if you're focusing on how they're drilling it down and where they're drilling down, again, I think it's just going to make you understand the business at a really different level. So focusing on, you need to hone your craft, of course, and that's not what we're really here to talk about. But when you just think about your business acumen and being a business advisor, which is really what your board is, they're advising the business on strategic direction. Do we have the right strategy? To be the best business advisor, you need to really understand the business. There's just no substitute for that. And so we're trying to help you guys think of what are the best ways to really understand the business and to be able to compare it, one company to their competitors to the next. And I think those are great ways to do that. And you can't really start that early enough.
As April said, a lot of us went to law school because we didn't necessarily like math, but there are lots of programs to the rescue. I did a mini MBA program at Berkeley. Most universities have some kind of executive education mini MBA program. If you're not like Delissa and you didn't get a joint MBA JD, you can also do lots of online programming. And then last I'll mention, ACC, Association of Corporate Counsel, has a program specifically for lawyers learning finance. And that can be very helpful because like the one I went to at a university was not geared towards lawyers, whereas the ACC program is. So don't be intimidated by we're now telling you all this stuff about financials and math and business. There are resources if that's not in your undergrad or your JD MBA skill set. So Alex, something besides business and financial, what would you do differently? What would you focus on?
So first of all, I have to say I totally agree on the business and financial. I mean, that would be the number one. But so I mentioned earlier on how proactive I was in trying to get into the boardroom, but I never in my wildest dreams really thought about becoming a board member or what it would take or getting prepared for it. So kudos to all of you who are on this webinar because you're far ahead of where I was, even up in my senior partner ranks. It was just not in my, so April mentioned being intentful. I was not intentful at all, and I didn't start early enough. So my guidance would be a couple of things. Now that you're here and you understand, really try to figure out, are the areas of law that I'm focusing on, are those areas that are going to be valuable for the future, and ergo making me valuable in the future as a board member? Do you have an opportunity to perhaps take on some type of a business role? If you're in-house in particular, this could happen. Many times I actually have a couple of friends who were lawyers, switched to maybe law professor, did all sorts of pivots, then became head of IR, now are leading strategy. And one of them in particular is thinking of, why not CEO? Maybe not at the big public company where I'm working now, but at another company. And if you can manage that, then you're golden, right? Because CEOs are always, snapped up as board members. Are you developing and nurturing your network? Other stories I've heard and can witness is board seats, come up through these networks that of people that you've worked with 10, 15 years ago, and who happen to be, a fellow. I heard of a story of a woman who was an IP lawyer looking for a board seat, and the coach who was coaching her said, this is not likely, that's not a real high, priority item for boards. Sure enough, she reached out to one of her other IP colleagues from years ago. They were offered a board seat they couldn't take because of a conflict, recommended her, and voila, she's a board member. So develop those relationships and maintain them. And then finally, we didn't talk much about, I know this is sort of 101 mentorship. Try to get that sponsor. I recently heard about a board member who has Alan Mulally as her sponsor. He is the former CEO of Ford Motor Company. And he heard of an opportunity at a board, recommended her in, and she's right. And you can't get a better recommendation than that, right? So try to foster and find those people who are in and around the boardroom who can be influential, that can really help you. These are all things I wish I had done that I didn't, but you can do it.
Thank you. I love just ask, and now I love why not be CEO. Great inspiration. Thanks, Alex. Okay, I hear we have lots of questions. So Kelsey, please rejoin us and ask some of your favorite questions. I'm sorry, it sounds like we have a lot, so we won't get to all of them, but ask a few.
We do. We have quite a few, so we'll try to get to as many as possible. So we've received several questions kind of along the same lines of what attracted you to board service? Why did you choose to pursue board service? And how did you know you were actually ready to take on that first board position?
I'll jump in and I'll try to, we'll go short, so we'll have the lightning round. We'll get through a lot of questions. But I would say you probably need to be in the C-suite. And so that takes a while to get there. There certainly are people who are maybe the level right below the C-suite who are on boards. But number one, you need the support of your CEO. And if you're still working and you're a full-time executive, you really can only do one, if that. And so your company needs to support you. And most companies are probably not going to support people who are below the C-suite. Again, some companies will let you go one level down. But think about it is by the time you get to that phase in your career, you have developed a body of expertise that boards are going to want. And so I think you need to, it's going to take probably that long.
Okay, Kelsey, next question.
All right, the next one. Are nonprofit boards a recommended starting place for corporate boards? And second to that, are private boards a recommended starting place for public board service?
I'll start
Melissa,
off.
you're shaking your head, so go.
I have been diligent about supporting nonprofits for my entire career. It's a great place to kind of get your chops. And actually, when I was being considered for my first board, they wanted to talk to references, not just my former CEO or other board members that saw me in action as an executive. They wanted to talk to people who saw me in action as a board member. And so I had that network that they could go to, people that saw me in action in a governance mode, but for a nonprofit. So totally think that's a great place to start. I also, personally, I think that private company boards, it's a totally different world. And for me, it's been a great learning because I was always with a public company. So now I'm learning all about private equity and the dynamics there. And it's very focused on business. And so it's helping me with my acumen to keep it up in the enterprise software industry. So for me, it's a great place for me to also get that board experience. May not be the right stuff for everybody, but if that sounds like it's you, I would recommend it.
So I would just follow up on Delissa, completely agree. Unfortunately, I think if you ask, the search firms, not all nonprofits are equal. And so and I'm on a couple of nonprofit boards that, are my passion, but they would not qualify for, something that a search consultant would get excited about. If you can find a nonprofit board that fits your passion, but also is substantive enough, that has, sort of other board members that are leaders in their community, that would be ideal, because in addition to learning about how the board functions, you also are developing that network. And a lot of, I think, board recommendations come from a sizable network. So you can try to get that if you can.
Kelsey.
All right. How would someone from a non-corporate background, such as restructuring or litigation, orient themselves for a board career? Does anyone have thoughts?
I've seen lots of people do that. They usually focused on the audit type of work, compliance type of work. But you are going to have to study corporate governance somewhat. I'll just get us started. But Alex, you look like you might have something to add to that.
Well, I was thinking about a couple of women that I heard, join public boards, usually sort of in the regulatory. So if you are a healthcare lawyer, for instance, and you've been a partner and represented a company for years and years, that company is looking for a board member, you would be ideal, right? If in regulatory areas, I think people are more, boards are more apt to look for that type of expertise as opposed to general manufacturing or industry. So I think it's still there. Litigation too. I mean, if you do high risk, activist type of litigation, and you've got a company that it knows that it's about to enter into that phase, that might be a great, skill set that they're looking for. So there is opportunity. You can learn the corporate governance along the way. So don't lose heart if you're not in SEC corporate M&A.
Kelsey?
All right. We've touched on this a little bit, but we received multiple questions along these lines. So these questions are about P&L experience. So one person asked, not all CLOs have the opportunity to lead P&L. Is there an appetite for those CLOs to still sit on boards? And the second kind of similar question was, this person had been told that direct P&L experience is critical for any public board seat, and kind of wanted to gauge the panelists' reaction to that as a mandate for board service.
And let me just start by explaining, in case anybody is a litigator, for example, and is on saying what language are they speaking right now. So P&L is profit and loss. And while lots of people manage budgets, for example, some people actually have revenue generating experience. And that's essentially what this question is getting to, in case anyone is not to the point of having that in their repertoire. Well, that's a good question. Did any of you lead a P&L? I mean, I was a general counsel and then had lots of other responsibilities at Gap for 10 years, and I didn't lead a P&L even when I ran 6 different functions. They were all expense-based.
I ran a P&L at a law firm, so I haven't, since I've been in-house. So Alex and I, our backgrounds are so similar, which is maybe why we're such fast friends. But I ran a P&L at a law firm, which I think is very relevant and very helpful experience. But I don't think that was kind of the deciding factor when companies were talking to me about board service. And so I don't think there is really any one thing. What I would say is, kind of going back to what I said earlier, is we very much, 20 years ago, it used to be, it was almost impossible to get on a board if you weren't a CEO or a general or, a law school, an academic that was like running an institution or running a college. But now that really has changed a lot. Companies are very much looking for more diversity on their boards in a very broad sense, right? Diversity of experiences and backgrounds and industries, et cetera. And so I wouldn't say absolutely you're not going to be able to join a board if you haven't run a P&L. I mean, most of us have not, 3 of us sitting here haven't run a P&L in a traditional sense, like at a public company. And so, no, I mean, that's great experience, right? If you go and do that, absolutely. But it's not dispositive for being a strong board member.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, Kelsey.
All right, sounds great. This question, this one has multiple parts, so it's a great last one. How much diversity or lack thereof are you seeing on the boards in which you serve today? Has it changed from when you first joined your boards? And are you seeing equity in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera?
My experience myself was from 0 to 4 women, so that was pretty exciting. What about you? Alex, then April, then Delissa. Let's have you each answer. How diverse are your boards, and are your boards getting more diverse? I sure hope so.
So until our one of our board members retired earlier this year, we had 4 women on the technical board, which is great, very significant. It's not majority, it's not half, but it's 4 out of 10. And so it was great to see that. And the last couple of new board members were women. Solid Power, we also have 3 board members out of 9. And so That I think we have really made progress, significant progress, where we are making less, or the progress isn't been as great. And from my experience is on the the ethnic diversity and the racial diversity, that you typically see one. I don't think you see two very often, because so we need to work and to really make sure that we grow those areas as well.
So I'll speak to both boards that I've been a part of. So the Federal Home Loan Bank, great diversity. We had a woman who was our head of audit and a woman who was the head of corporate governance, as I mentioned at the beginning. And now they have a woman, I've rolled off that board, but a woman who's chair of the board. And so strong diversity there. I think, again, we can always continue to see more. We're just talking about diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender. And then when I joined the train board, it was really interesting. I joined during COVID. So everything I did was by video. And I was so pleasantly surprised. One of my first conversations with them, or maybe second conversation, was a group video with a number of people on the board. And I think there were already 4 women when I joined. It might be 5, and now we're 6, and one person has rolled off. So maybe now we're back to 5. But that really changes the dynamics in the boardroom. I think we have 10 or 11 directors. And so if you think about almost a majority, or sorry, almost half of the board members are women. And it was interesting, when I first joined the board and look around at just the dynamics and the conversation, you can really see that. It really changes the dynamics in the boardroom, that it's not kind of focused on one style of communication, for example. And they were very vocal about that in my first video call. And I could see that they just had such a great camaraderie amongst the board members. You could tell that they all really like each other and respect each other's opinions and backgrounds and perspectives, even though they're all very different. And there are a lot of people who have been CEOs and then many people that have not. And so that was just very refreshing. It's a fantastic board.
Delissa, what about your experience? This is newer for you.
It is. I'll go back to the Red Hat experience because I had the opportunity to be a part of that whole process of changing out the board from the the buddy system to an independent board. And what I saw over the years was just an incredible positive momentum of going from I got to be a CEO, to April's point, to it's got to be someone who adds value in a different way, because we already have a few CEOs on the board. And our diversity ended up being pretty stellar. With regard to my current boards, I'm the first independent director to join both of those boards, and the first woman. And that's kind of usual for me. I'm used to it from the tech industry from years ago. I'm used to being the only, but my goal is that we continue to diversify and then really have an independent set of members that are, add the diversity that we need to the board. And we're also working on our governance practices. The journey continues.
Thank you. I think that we are out of time, and I hear an echo now, so I apologize for that. But we encourage you, first of all, thank you to our incredible panelists. Thank you, Delissa, April, and Alex, for being with us today, for sharing your insights and your perspectives. And then thank you to our audience for being here. We invite you to join our next webinar. You can check it out at directwomen.org in the coming months, and our next Direct Women webinar will feature our honorees. So I'm sure that will be another great program. And if you have a moment, and it'll just be a moment, fill out the survey that will automatically come up at the end of the live webinar, because we want to take your information and help us have great future programs. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you so very much.